evening. My name's John Markham. I'm president of the USC Emeriti Association. Since 2004, the association, in collaboration with the Office of the Chancellor, has presented lectures by distinguished emeriti. In fact, the first of these lectures was given by tonight's speaker, but he comes to us tonight with a difference. He comes to us as a newly anointed Constantino Pannunzio Distinguished Professor. That's a university-wide award for research and activities in social sciences and humanities since retirement. Named after the UCLA professor who created it, the award is an outcome of a rigorous system-wide vetting process from a search committee on the local Emeriti Association's campus to a system-wide selection committee at UCLA. Given the extraordinary honor and special circumstances surrounding it, I've asked an earlier Pannunzio winner, 2004, and longtime associate of our speaker, social psychologist Thomas Pettigrew, to introduce him to us. And I should remind you as well, at the end of the speech in the evening, there'll be refreshments and a reception in the atelier just behind the top up there. Tom Pettigrew.
Thank you, John. It's a pleasure and privilege this evening to introduce our award-winning speaker, Professor Elliot Aronson. It's a special pleasure for me because we've been friends for 52 long years. Elliot received his PhD at Stanford in 1959, and he was immediately hired by Harvard University and the old social relations department to become an assistant professor of social psychology, where I was also serving in the same role. Later, Elliot taught at the University of Minnesota and the University of Texas before coming to UCSC in 1974. 5 years later, I left Harvard and joined him here again at UCSC. Elliot has won no less than 15 major fellowships and awards, including the Pannunzio Award we celebrate tonight. Most remarkably, he's the only psychologist ever to have won all three of the highest awards of the American Psychological Association: for research, for writing, and for teaching. In research, Elliot is famous in the profession for high-impact laboratory experiments in the great social psychological tradition of Kurt Lewin. I've written that he is the ultimate Lewinian of his cohort, and he is one of the principal people responsible for that high ranking of UCSC in research influence. Best known, perhaps, is his empirical and theoretical work on cognitive dissonance, a phenomenon that has now entered popular discourse. Just as important, I think, Elliot has effectively applied his research findings to a host of real-world problems, from racial segregation in schools to energy and water conservation, and to combating AIDS and occupational burnout. His talk tonight will give further evidence of this special talent. His graceful and forceful writing of technical texts and popular books have made them highly influential. His acclaimed text, The Social Animal, is now in its 11th edition. And one social psychologist has suggested that his texts have probably persuaded more students to decide to become social psychologists than any other writings. Finally, Elliot's teaching skills have been appreciated by literally thousands of students here at UCSC and other campuses. After winning the teaching award at the University of Texas in 1973, Elliot came to UCSC and in 1979 won a similar alumni teaching award here. And I have testimony of my own son, Mark, to support this acclaim. Mark enjoyed every lecture of Elliot's introductory social psychology course, and then suddenly one evening at the family dinner table, he explained that now he finally understood what I'd been talking about all this time. Now, for all these reasons, we're privileged tonight to hear Elliot speak on the psychology of self-persuasion. Elliot Aronson.
Thank you so much, Tom, for that very kind introduction. Before I start, I'd like to introduce my guide and friend, Desi Lou. Desi Lou is a wonderful animal, comes to me courtesy of a terrific institution called Guide Dogs for the Blind right here in San Rafael in Northern California. And they breed their dogs, they train them to lead blind people around. And then they train us for 3 weeks, 3 intensive weeks, and then they send us home with a dog, and it's all without cost. So if you happen to know somebody who is blind or almost completely blind, like I am, you might want to inform them about this place. It's a magnificent institution. It's a pleasure to be here. And what I want to do, although this place and this situation seems incredibly formal, I was even waiting for the past 20 minutes in a place called the Green Room over there. I thought maybe I was on the Tonight Show or something. It seems incredibly formal, but I hope you didn't come here expecting to hear a formal lecture, because as any of my former students would be happy to tell you, I don't give lectures, I tell stories. I am a chronic and habitual storyteller, and I see no reason to stop doing that now. So what I'm going to be doing tonight for the next 70 minutes or so is tell you a story, and it's a love story. It's really about my ongoing love affair with social psychology. Let's see, where is that thing? Let's see if that works. It does. It says 50 years of research or something like that. My 50 years of experimental research in social psychology. And as one of my friends pointed out a few days ago, I've been a social psychologist for much more than 50 years. I've been a professional social psychologist for 50 years, but I've been an amateur social psychologist practically all my life. I think in a sense, all of us are amateur social psychologists because we live in a social world, and we're forever forming and testing hypotheses about human interaction and social influence. And when I think back on my childhood, one of my most vivid childhood memories comes from when I was about 9 years old. Show picture of 9-year-old boy. That's me. We were the only Jewish family in a virulently anti-Semitic blue-collar neighborhood in a small city near Boston, Massachusetts. And my parents were Orthodox and used to send me to Hebrew school in the evening, every evening, which was in a small Jewish enclave on the other side of town. And coming home at night, I was frequently taunted by gangs of teenage anti-Semites shouting anti-Semitic slogans at me and occasionally pushing me around and every once in a while roughing me up. And I remember here's the vivid memory. When I was 9 years old, after one of these beatings, I remember sitting on a curb, nursing a bloody nose and a split lip, and feeling very sorry for myself, and wondering why these kids hated Jews so much. Were they born hating Jews, or did someone teach them to hate Jews? And wondering why they hated me so much when they didn't even know me. And wondering, gee, if they got to know me better and discovered what a sweet and charming little boy I was, would they like me more? And if they liked me more, might that not mean that they might hate other Jews less? These are profound social psychological questions. Needless to say, I didn't realize it at the time, but they are profound social psychological questions because at the heart of social psychology is the notion of change, of social influence, of persuasion. Now, when we think of persuasion, Desilu, speaking of persuasion, Desilu, I need you to sit, and down. Good girl. Stay right there. Okay. In vaudeville, they say never follow a dog act, but here the dog is part of the act. Okay. You stay there and stop looking so damn cute. When we think of persuasion, most of us think of advertising, political speeches like the endless Republican debates that are ongoing now. And this is persuasion from the outside in, where somebody is presenting a message and they want the audience to buy their brand of toothpaste, vote for them, or whatever. That is sometimes effective. The effects are usually small and often very short-lived. There's another kind of persuasion, and that is from the inside out, and that's what I call self-persuasion, and that's what this lecture is about. I first became acquainted or began to think seriously about the phenomenon of self-persuasion, which is much more powerful, much more effective than persuasion from the outside in, when I met this guy, Leon Festinger, who I think Tom already mentioned, who invented the theory of cognitive dissonance. Leon Festinger was my mentor in graduate school and eventually became one of my closest friends. I've known an awful lot of smart people in my life. Some were my teachers, some were my colleagues, some were my students. But I've only met one person who I would call an outright genius, and that was Leon Festinger, an incredibly brilliant guy who, among a great many other things, invented probably the most important theory in social psychology, the theory of cognitive dissonance. The theory of cognitive dissonance is a very simple theory with huge ramifications. Stated in the simplest possible way, if a person holds two cognitions, ideas, beliefs, pieces of information, where the one contradicts the other, that person is in a state of dissonance. And dissonance is a negative drive state, like intense hunger or intense thirst, and is painful. And the person tries to reduce that dissonance, to reduce the pain, by changing one or both cognitions to bring them closer together. For example, the classic example, if a person smokes a pack of cigarettes a day and then learns that cigarette smoking causes cancer, his cognition that he's smoking is dissonant with his cognition that smoking causes cancer. The simplest way to reduce dissonance in this situation would be to stop smoking. But suppose that person has tried several times and can't stop, then what does he do? He tries to convince himself that the evidence linking cigarette smoking to cancer is not all that good, that old John Carruthers is 97 years old and has been smoking 2 packs a day since he was 11, so how could it be dangerous? That it's debonair to smoke, and I'd rather live a shorter, more exciting life as a smoker than a longer life as a non-smoker. Those are the ways a person would reduce dissonance and allow himself to sleep at night, having removed a great deal of the dissonance caused by those two incompatible cognitions. My own small contribution to the theory of cognitive dissonance as a theory is that I discovered early on that dissonance is at its strongest and at its most powerful when one of those cognitions is the self-concept that a person holds. For example, Desi, down, sit, sit, good girl, good girl. Little reinforcement. If one of those cognitions is the self-concept, almost all of us believe that we are smart, competent, and moral, decent people. Indeed, just like the folks in Lake Wobegon, we all think we're better than average when it comes to smartness, competence, and morality. So in the very first experiment I ever did as a graduate student, I had the hypothesis that if a person goes through hell and high water in order to join a group, all other things being equal, he is going to find that group more attractive than if he gets into the group with little or no effort. The reason for that is, since you think of yourself as a smart, competent person, and you go into through hell and high water in order to get into the group, and then the group turns out to be objectively not very interesting, then all of the negative things about that group are dissonant with the fact that you worked very hard to get into the group. Therefore, you begin to downplay the negative aspects of the group and emphasize the positive aspects of the group. So we did a simple little experiment, Judson Mills and I, in which we randomly assigned college students to one of 3 conditions. They wanted to get into this ongoing discussion group on the psychology of sex, and some went through no initiation at all, some went through a very mild initiation in order to get in, and some went through a severe initiation. Then they listened to, each individual person listened to the same tape recording of a group discussion being held by that particular group that they had joined. So the stimulus they were listening to was exactly the same, and you can see from the chart up there that the people in the mild initiation group and the no initiation group did not like the group very much. As a matter of fact, some of them never wanted to go to another meeting. It was a very boring discussion, as boring as you can make sexual behavior. They were talking about the secondary sex characteristics of birds and things like that. And they were hemming and hawing, and it was really boring. And some of them wanted out. They didn't want to go to another meeting, whereas the people who went through hell and high water in order to get into the group really liked the group. Now, this wasn't magical. When I interviewed people afterwards, like there was one part of the tape, for example, where one of the students was supposed to have done some reading on his own and report it back to the group. And when they asked him about it on the recording, he said, well, I'm sorry, I was very busy last week and I didn't get a chance to do the reading. The people who had nothing invested in the group in those two conditions said, that's awful. What an irresponsible guy. He was supposed to have done the reading and he didn't do it. That's dreadful. Whereas the people in the severe initiation group, almost all of them said, how nice he was, look how honest he was. Instead of trying to bullshit people around, he actually told the truth and said he didn't do the reading. So the world is a complicated place. And to the extent that we're motivated to see the good things about the whatever it is, we will do it. Whereas if we're not motivated, and that motivation is the need to justify our own effort and hard work. Let's take cheating. Suppose you're a college student. For some of you in the audience, I assume that's not much of a supposition. But suppose you're a college student and you're in your senior year and you want to go to medical school and you're taking a really important biology course and you have a pretty good idea that if you do well on this final exam and get a good grade in this particular course, you will be accepted to a great many medical schools, whereas if you don't do well, you will probably not get accepted to medical school. You prepare for the exam and you think you know the stuff pretty well, but you get into the exam and you draw a complete blank. Lo and behold, you look at the questions and it's like your worst nightmare. It seems like it's from a different course. You can't even understand the questions, let alone give the answers. You go into a panic. You break into a cold sweat. You say, oh my God, there goes medical school. What's my mommy and daddy going to think? And this is dreadful. There goes my whole career. What am I going to do? I'm going to work at McDonald's. And suddenly you look around and you see that you happen to be sitting right behind the smartest person in the class, who also happens to have the largest, most legible handwriting in the class. And all you have to do is look over her shoulder, and there are the answers right there. The question is, do you cheat or don't you cheat? Now, whichever decision you make, you will experience cognitive dissonance. If you decide to cheat, the notion that cheating is not a good thing to do is dissonant with your self-concept as a decent, moral human being. If you decide not to cheat, the cognition that you had an opportunity to virtually guarantee your admission to medical school is dissonant with your cognition that you failed to take that opportunity. How do you resolve the dissonance? Imagine for the moment that there are two people standing right at the top of that pyramid, and let's imagine that they have almost identical attitudes toward cheating. They think it's not a good thing to do, it's not the worst thing in the world, but you shouldn't do it, okay? Let's say their attitudes are almost identical, they're only a hair's breadth apart. But one of them decides to cheat, and the other one decides not to cheat. Then what happens to their attitudes toward cheating? Well, within a very short time, they begin to slide down different sides of the pyramid, and their attitudes begin to change, so that within a day or two, one of them thinks that cheating is okay, it's a victimless crime, everybody does it, I would have been a fool not to do it, and it's really important that I go to medical school. Whereas the other one thinks that cheating is about the worst thing a person can do. It's not a victimless crime because there are other people, we're being graded on a curve, if I get into medical school and somebody else doesn't, I'm cheating them out of that medical school. It's a horrendous thing. Anyone who cheats should be immediately expelled from school without recourse and maybe should be publicly shamed and pilloried, okay? Just a little before, they were almost identical, but once they take action, their self-concept forces them to change their attitudes powerfully. Now, early on, I said that persuasion from the inside out is more powerful and more long-lasting than persuasion from the outside in. If I were to give them a lecture on the dangers of cheating, or a lecture saying, hey, cheating isn't so bad, everybody does it, this is the world we live in, and then later they found someone who was telling them the opposite, and they asked themselves, well, how come I believe what I do about cheating? Oh, that guy Aronson told me about it, and that's it. Whereas if it comes from the inside, if you've convinced yourself, you're not aware of where it came from. It seems like you've always felt that way. That's what makes it so powerful. Now, for the most part, that's a canoe, by the way. You wonder why I'm showing you a picture of a canoe. Well, I'll get there. Let me say that dissonance is hardwired. It probably has evolved. It had evolutionary merit in the sense that when we're good at reducing dissonance, we sleep well at night. And if we sleep well at night, if our ancient ancestors slept well at night, then when they got up in the morning to hunt, they were probably more successful at hunting. If they were being chased by a lion, a tiger, or a bear, they were probably more effective at escaping from the lion, the tiger, and the bear, so that we have evolved as people who are pretty good at reducing dissonance. It also operates at an unconscious level. We don't sit down and say, oh, well, I think I'll reduce a little dissonance right now. We do it just below the level of awareness. In most situations, it's benign. It doesn't really hurt because it does help us sleep at night. It helps us live with ourselves if we commit embarrassing blunders or make mistakes or make difficult decisions. It really helps us live with that decision. So, personal story. When my wife, Vera, and I were living in Minneapolis. I was teaching at the University of Minnesota. We had 4 little kids, and we finally decided to buy a house. This was in late November, rather than rent, and we didn't have much money. We didn't have hardly any money, so there were only 2 houses that we liked that we could afford, and they couldn't have been more different. One of them was close to campus, close to the university, walking distance from the university, and it was a nice little Victorian house, but it had a very small backyard, no real place for our kids to play, and it was near an industrial area where there were factories whose major products seemed to be soot and pollution, and so that was a difficult thing. But boy, it was close to the university, and I always wanted to be Mr. Chips and have my graduate students come over in the late afternoon for a coffee or a scotch or something, and we could design research, and I had dreams about that, living that close to campus. Wow. The other place was a 20-minute drive out in the suburbs from campus. It was a nice house. It had a big backyard, and it was only a half-mile away from a lake, Lake Owasso. So Vera and I went back and forth, and we finally decided to buy the house in the suburbs. This was in late November. We moved in, and in early December, mid-December, I'm driving home from school in my old station wagon, and Vera looks out the kitchen window, and I had a canoe lashed to the top of my station wagon. And I walked into the house, and Vera was laughing. And I said, what's so funny about this canoe? Because it's used, and I got it for a good price, and we live near a lake and everything like that. I said, what's so funny? She said, ask Leon Festinger. And I realized This was December. We wouldn't be able to use that canoe until the middle of May sometime. Minneapolis, do you know what it's like in Minneapolis in December? People take shortcuts by driving across the lakes. As a matter of fact, the unofficial first day of spring in Minneapolis is noted by the first time a car sinks through the ice to the bottom of the lake. That's what Minneapolis is like. So what am I doing with a canoe in December? Well, you might think that that canoe was lying around, taking up space in our garage for 5 months, doing nothing, but it was fulfilling a really vital function. It was helping me rest easy with that decision, because that canoe meant it bolstered the decision. It meant, yeah, it's okay not to live on the edge of campus because I can always do that canoe. At least it would have been very helpful if Vera hadn't told me what a fool I was for having bought that canoe that early. Because it did operate under that's what I mean by it being an unconscious thing, because I, who was well-versed in the theory of cognitive dissonance, really went for it. I really bought that canoe. Do you recognize this picture? If you do, say, ah. If you don't, you really should. You students in there, this is Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman in the classic movie Casablanca, all the critics rated as one of the 3 or 4 great movies of all times. Here's the scene. Ingrid Bergman and Humphrey Bogart are lovers, but Ingrid Bergman is married to this other guy, Paul Henreid. It's during the Second World War. It's around 1942. Casablanca is occupied by the Nazis. Ingrid Bergman's husband, Paul Henreid, is a great spokesperson against the Nazis, and he's on a plane that's headed into freedom, but she wants to stay behind with her lover, Humphrey Bogart. And then Humphrey Bogart makes this wonderful speech to her. He says to her, and I quote, "If that plane leaves the ground and you're not with him, you'll regret it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon and for the rest of your life. If that plane leaves the ground and you're not with him, you'll regret it. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but soon and for the rest of your life." It's a beautiful speech. It's a very romantic speech. It's a very unselfish speech. And it's absolutely wrong. Psychologically, it's absolutely wrong. Because if that plane left the ground and she stayed with Humphrey Bogart, she might regret it today. She might regret it tomorrow. But soon, and for the rest of her life, she would have succeeded in reducing dissonance by convincing herself that she did the right thing, the dangerous thing, the exciting thing, the romantic thing, and stayed with her husband. Indeed, when she got on that plane with Paul Henreid, she immediately probably started reducing dissonance in the other direction by convincing herself that she was doing the right thing, the moral thing, the good thing. That does not mean that we never have any regrets. Of course we do. But when you think of all the thousands of decisions we make every year, isn't it amazing how few regrets we do have? Most of the time, our unconscious is busily convincing ourselves that we did the right thing. When Prophecy Fails. This was the title of a book written by Leon Festinger and a couple of his colleagues who followed a doomsday cult in the 1950s in Chicago, who predicted the end of the world, and it was a rather small group of people, but they gave up their jobs, they gave away all of their possessions, and They were supposed to be picked up in the backyard of this house by a spaceship who was going to transmit them to another planet, transport them to another planet, and they were instructed, they got instructions from the people on the spaceship to take all the metal off their clothes, so the guys, ripped the zippers off their pants and things like that. And they were waiting in the backyard for this spaceship that was supposed to come at midnight. It's a nice picture because it shows that it was 1 minute after midnight, and that's indeed what happened. It's 1 minute after midnight. All those spaceships, they're always late. You can never find a spaceship when you need one. And then it was 12:30, and it was 1:10, and they checked their watches to make sure they were right. And finally, the leader of the group got a message that because of the faith of this small group, they saved the earth. They kept it from being destroyed. And they immediately went out and started to proselytize, and they became a much larger group because they really believed that it was their faith that saved the world. More recently, of course, we have Harold Camping, who predicted the end of the world 4 or 5 different times. Once in the 1980s, once in the 1990s, and recently, in last May 21st, it was supposed to end, and then when it didn't end on May 21st, did Harold Camping say, "What an idiot I am. I'm wrong. It's not going to end." No, he said, well, this was the spiritual ending. The real ending will come on October 21st, 2000. Oh my God, we're still here. When they predict the end of the world, they almost never say, what an idiot I am, I blew it. They always say something like, a slight miscalculation. I didn't figure in that thing, I didn't figure in that thing. I'll really recalculate and then it'll get there. Now, I say most of the time it's benign. In the canoe example, it's benign. In the Humphrey Bogart, Ingrid Bergman example, it's benign. You have to make a difficult decision, and if it helps you sleep at night, you might as well reduce that dissonance. In this case, it's not benign. People gave up their life savings, people gave up their jobs in following this false prophet. So it can have some real negative consequences. For example, he wasn't predicting the end of the world. This is our former president. As you may recall, he decided to invade Iraq about 8.5 years ago, and we're still there. He convinced us, convinced Congress, and convinced most Americans that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and was dangerous and could use them against us. Most of my liberal friends think that George Bush was simply lying, that he was pulling the wool over our eyes. I suspect, and I'm pretty sure, that he wasn't pulling the wool over our eyes, he was pulling the wool over his own eyes. He was hell-bent on invading Iraq. He hated Saddam Hussein for a lot of reasons. Saddam tried to assassinate his father. Saddam was taunting us. Maybe there were other reasons, like perhaps we could get our hands on some of that oil in Iraq. Maybe we can have bases in Iraq, etc. There were reasons why an invasion of Iraq seemed like a good thing to do. He wanted to do it, no question about it. Did he lie to us or did he lie to himself? My strong feeling is, that he lied to himself because the reports coming in from the CIA and other places were ambiguous. Some said that he probably had weapons, some said he almost certainly didn't. My guess is that because Bush was hell-bent on invading Iraq, he read those reports in a biased manner, much the same way that the people in my initiation experiment looked at the group discussion in a biased manner. They looked and saw all the positive things and they downplayed the negative things. I believe that Bush looked at the evidence supporting Saddam's having weapons of mass destruction and accepted that. Why do I feel that way? Because he was a good enough politician not to get caught red-handed. When a few weeks went by after the invasion, after mission accomplished was declared, and people began to ask, well, where are those weapons of mass destruction? Bush and his cohort and his colleagues kept saying, oh, they'll show up. Iraq is a big country. They're there. We'll find them. Don't worry about that. We'll find them. Why do you do that if you don't think they're there? And then when a few months went by and they kept saying, we'll find them, finally they had to admit, shamefacedly, well, I guess they're not there, but Saddam is a bad guy anyway. So I don't think they would have been caught short in that obvious lie if it was a lie. I think he succeeded in pulling the wool over his own eyes, and that, I would submit, when the most powerful person in the world pulls the wool over his own eyes, when he reduces dissonance in ways like this, it's much more dangerous than if he was simply lying to us. And we know that Bush was particularly good at it. This is from Scott McClellan, who was an insider in the Bush White House. He wrote a book a couple of years ago in which he said this about George Bush. In effect, what McClellan, who, as far as I know, knows nothing about dissonance theory, is saying that George Bush was particularly good at reducing dissonance. Let's turn briefly to medicine. This fellow here is a man named Ignaz Semmelweis. Ignaz Semmelweis was a physician in Vienna in the middle of the 19th century. In the middle of the 19th century, there was a really terrible outbreak of something that they called childbed fever throughout Europe, but mostly in Middle Europe, but throughout Europe, where women giving birth in hospitals, 35% of them were coming down with childbed fever. 1/3 of those died. It was fatal to about 12 of the 35% of the people who came down with childbed fever. Semmelweis noticed that women giving birth at home had a much lower rate of childbed fever, much lower mortality rate. He surmised that perhaps, this was before we knew much about germs. The germ theory was not well known. It was barely registering in the middle of the 19th century. And he said, maybe these physicians were coming, as they were, directly from autopsies, directly from cadavers. Maybe they're carrying some bad stuff on their hands, and then they're visiting the women. And so he instructed his own interns and students to wash their hands in a chlorine solution before attending to any woman, and he reduced the incidence of mortality among his patients to less than 1%. When he announced this to his colleagues, did they greet him with open arms and say, "Oh, Ignaz, thank you, my God, you've changed everything, and now all we have to do is wash our hands and look at all the lives we can save. No, they didn't. No, they didn't. They said, bugger off, Ignatz. You can't tell us that we're killing our own patients. And it took several years before Semmelweis's discovery sunk in and took effect. Why? Because these physicians were evil people? I don't think so. The irony, and I would call it the supreme irony, is it's because they thought they were good people. It's because they thought they were highly intelligent, highly competent, and highly moral, that they couldn't accept the idea that through their own carelessness, they might have been killing their own patients, that they rejected Semmelweis and his ideas. That's the irony. Let's turn briefly to law. As we speak, according to the Innocence Project, there are hundreds of people languishing in prison who are almost certainly innocent of their crimes because DNA evidence has shown up after their conviction and incarceration that demonstrates that they couldn't possibly, that the crime was committed by somebody else. Hundreds. And it turns out that more often than not, if the prosecuting attorney, if the person who convicted these people, any of these people, is the same one who needs to reopen the case, they refuse to reopen it. Whereas if that person has died or retired or left and a case comes before someone else, they are much more likely to reopen the case. Because the person who did the convicting is not evil, but can't believe that that a person could be languishing in prison for 20 years for a crime he didn't commit, and I sent him there, therefore we'll keep him in prison for another 20 years. That's the irony. In this example I'm giving you, these are the so-called Central Park Five. Some of you may remember there was a very famous case in the 1990s of the Central Park jogger. A young woman was jogging in Central Park and was brutally beaten and raped and almost died, barely survived. The police rounded up these 5 guys. They were interrogated, and they confessed to the crime, and they were sent to prison. There was something wrong with the case. Their confessions did not coincide with each other. They were at odds with one another. There was a semen found on the clothing of the woman, and it did not match the DNA of any of these 5 guys. About 10 years later, another man, a man named Reyes, who was serving time for a similar crime. This was rape and murder, and he had a sentence of life imprisonment without parole, confessed to having done the Central Park beating and rape. And indeed, when they took his DNA, it was a perfect match for the DNA they found on the woman. 1 chance in a billion that would happen if he wasn't the person. This is Linda Fairstein, who was the prosecuting attorney in the Central Park jogger case. When the evidence was presented to her, she absolutely refused to believe it. She said those kids are guilty and they're going to stay in prison. Finally, her superior, Robert Morgenthau, overruled her and vacated the sentences and released those guys from prison without even retrying them. Linda Fairstein then argued, well, okay, let's see, the DNA, well, maybe Reyes was in cahoots with these guys. But then it turned out that they didn't know each other. They had never met each other. Then, and she argued this in a national magazine, it probably happened that these 5 guys beat up the woman, practically killed her, and then Reyes came along later and raped her. That was her construction. She refused to believe that she could have sent the wrong people to prison, again, not because she's evil, but because she believed that she was competent and moral and smart. Couldn't bear to accept evidence to the contrary. As a footnote, let me say that Linda Fairstein then resigned from the district attorney's office and became a novelist, where she now writes, not best-selling, but she earns a living writing a series of novels about a fighting district attorney who is sending all these people to prison. So she's reducing dissonance in another way. Okay. Okay, this is how the human mind works, okay? This is how people think, this is how people reduce dissonance. Often it's benign, often it gets us into trouble. It does help us sleep at night, but sometimes at a great cost. Is there any way that we can take this phenomenon and turn it into something for the public good? In the 1980s, when we discovered AIDS, and AIDS was in epidemic proportions in this country, it was very scary. And then we realized that condoms could protect people against AIDS and other sexually transmitted diseases. On this campus, the Student Health Center asked me if I could do something to get students to get sexually active students to use condoms. We didn't want all students using condoms. I mean, that's what the right wing thinks. You know, you give away condoms, everybody is going to start having sexual intercourse all over the place. But students who are already sexually active. The Student Health Center had sent out pamphlets, they had shown films, they had tried to get people interested in using condoms, and we did a survey of students on this campus, and we found that about 17% of sexually active students were using condoms, even though almost all of them knew about AIDS, knew about other sexually transmitted diseases, but they didn't want to use condoms. And it was the same, almost the same number, same percentage on most campuses in this country. Only 17%. And they reduced dissonance by convincing themselves that certainly nobody I could be with could ever have AIDS. But the problem was, AIDS was never a significant problem on this campus, it turns out, but the problem was that a lot of people were coming in, a lot of students were coming in with other sexually transmitted diseases. So we knew they were having unprotected sex. And so it was always a big danger. So I tried to figure out, how do you get people to use condoms? I have to tell you, we interviewed people and students, and the main reason they weren't using condoms is because it was unromantic, it broke the flow, no, it broke the sequence of the, it broke the sequence of the romantic experience. You had to go into the bathroom to use it, etc. So the first thing that dawned on me was, well, why don't we make a film, a short video, eroticizing the condom, turning the condom into a part of foreplay, where it could be fun, where the woman puts the condom on the guy, you know, and it can be wonderful squirming and everything. And so we did. We made this video. I have to tell you, it was R-rated, not X-rated. We didn't show any body parts. All of the good things were happening under the sheet, but it was very clear that they were putting on a condom and really enjoying the whole process of using the condom. In other words, we took it out of the bathroom and brought it into the bedroom. And then we sat back and waited for those results to come pouring in. And it turned out that immediately after watching the film, some 72% of the students said yes, they would now start using condoms. And we had another dependent variable. We were selling condoms for 10 cents a piece, and the students were buying condoms, and we thought, okay, this is good. We came back 6 weeks later, and it turned out that they weren't using them. And the reason was clear when we interviewed them. They told us, well, we started to use them, and after I used them a few times, I learned that I wasn't having as much fun as the people on the movie were having. And indeed, I should have known better. That is persuasion from the outside in. From the outside in, hey, it looks like condoms can be fun, and then we try it and it's not fun, so we stop using them. That's exactly the point I was making at the beginning of this lecture. So, how do you do it from the inside out? And I racked my brains on this one for a while, and then finally I came up with a scenario. A lot of the ways that I would think up experimental procedures was by being a kind of a playwright and thinking of, now what kind of scenario would work here? Imagine the following thing. Imagine that you are a college student and you're sexually active and you're not using condoms, but you believe that, you know, you can tell who has AIDS and who doesn't. And you go home for Christmas vacation and you have a 16-year-old brother who has just discovered sex, and he's boasting to you about all of his sexual experiences and how exciting it is and everything like that. What do you say to him? Well, chances are, as a responsible sibling, you will say to him, it's great that you're enjoying yourself so much, but you know, there's AIDS out there, there's herpes out there, there's gonorrhea, there's syphilis, there's scabies, need I go on? And you really ought to protect yourself. Why don't you use condoms? Now, suppose further that I am a friend of the family and I happen to overhear this conversation. And suppose I say to you, that was really great advice you gave Charlie. By the way, how frequently do you use condoms? What we're doing here is confronting a person with his or her own hypocrisy. We're showing them that they're preaching one thing and practicing another thing. And since people like to think of themselves as decent, moral, smart, competent people with integrity, that creates dissonance. And there's only one good way to reduce dissonance, because you don't want to take back your advice. You start using condoms. So we set that up as an experiment. I don't have a lot of time. I'll go into a little bit of detail with the experiment. All we did was we got students to make a videotape arguing why, and we told them it was going to be played to high school students in sex education classes, and telling them why they should use condoms if they're going to be sexually active. And we gave them a set of arguments from which they could construct their own arguments. We videotaped it, and we convinced them that it was very convincing that we were going to use that in sex education classes. In another condition, we simply showed them a film like that. And in the third condition, we had them make the film, and then we confronted them with their own hypocrisy by interviewing them and asking them questions about their own sexual activity, and to recount the times to us when they found it difficult or impossible to use condoms, thereby getting them. See, people are pretty good, as you know. Anyone who knows the scene, the political scene, knows that the last person to discover that he's a hypocrite is the hypocrite himself. If you ever watch Jon Stewart, you see how these people, they come out against homosexuals, and the next thing you know, they're caught in a men's room. I mean, and it's embarrassing to the extent that hypocrisy goes on, because people compartmentalize. What we succeeded in doing in our experiment is breaking down the compartmentalization and forcing people to confront their own hypocrisy. And what we found initially, and the first part of the experiment, we gave them $10 for participating in the experiment, and then outside the door, we had one of our students was selling condoms for 10 cents a piece, and we found that in the hypocrisy condition, people who had money now were spending much more money on the condoms than people in the other condition. But the next question is, were they actually using them? 4 or 5 months later, we did a telephone survey of which the students thought was campus-wide for everybody, but was only about the people, we only called the people in our experiment, and the people doing the phone calling did not know which of the experimental conditions they were in. And what we found 5 months later was that almost 80% of the people in the hypocrisy condition reported that they were still using condoms, that they were using it every time they had sex. Whereas there were about 20% in the pamphlet, in the condition where they simply watched the movie, and about 35% in the condition where they made the movie, they made the video, but we didn't confront them with it. So almost 80% of these people were using condoms 5 months later. That's a powerful effect and perhaps life-saving. These are people taking a shower. We did a hypocrisy experiment in the shower room in the field house at this university. We were going through one of our periodic water shortages. Every 4 or 5 years there's a water shortage. The university wanted to instruct people to take shorter showers. They weren't doing it. We've learned through observation in the field house that the average shower a person took was 12 minutes. We set up a hypocrisy experiment in which we got people to commit themselves to say yes, to sign a petition on a big poster that was posted in the field house. Take shorter showers. If I can do it, so can you. And then we confronted them with their own hypocrisy. And the bottom line is, in that condition, we got their showers reduced to 3.5 minutes. Notice it isn't that we were telling them to conserve water. They were telling themselves to conserve water. It wasn't from the outside in, it was from the inside out. They convinced themselves to take short showers because otherwise they would feel like a hypocrite. I've got about 10 more minutes to this talk. Are you still with me, or are you against me? This is Stanley Milgram. Stanley Milgram, is that a name you know? He did perhaps the most famous experiment ever done in social psychology, where he had 2 people come in, one of whom was a real participant, the other one was a stooge. He hooked one of them up to some wires that were going to cause him electric shocks, and the other one, the real participant, was in front of a toggle switch, and it was presented as a learning experiment, and every time the guy didn't get the right answer or didn't answer at all, you pressed one of those toggle switches, which went all the way from 50 volts all the way up gradually by gradations of 15 or 20 volts, all the way up to, there's one point where it was 450 volts, and then there was the last toggle switch after that. It was XXX, dangerous shock hazard, written on that board. And of course, the striking result Milgram got was that 65% of the people, and it didn't matter whether they were men or women, young or old, one country or another country, he did it in a great many places, 65% went all the way to the end, even though in some cases the person who they thought they were giving the electroshock was pounding on the wall and begging to be let out and saying he had a heart condition and all of that. 65% continued to obey. It's a powerful experiment. What Milgram also found, and what is of special interest to me in the context of this talk, is that afterwards, when he asked them about the victim, how they felt about him, almost all of them who went to the very end derogated the victim. They convinced themselves that the guy was an idiot, that he deserved what he got, etc. This is the vicious circle. If I consider myself a good person, and I've caused harm to an innocent person, I experience dissonance, therefore there's something wrong with that person, he deserved what he got. And that's how I can sleep at night afterwards. That's a powerful effect. Milgram found it in his experiment, and a great many other people in similar kinds of experiment found the same thing. The person does harm to another person, then derogates that person afterwards. Is there any way to turn that around? Let me give you a scenario, hypothetical. Suppose you're driving on a lonely country road at night, and your headlights pick up a person standing by his car with his arm in a sling, and the car obviously has a flat tire. What do? You stop, of course, to give assistance. You get out of your car, and you find that the guy standing there, who has a broken arm, is somebody you know and really don't like very much. What do? Well, you help him. You help him. And let's say it starts raining, and while you're fixing the flat, you get all covered with mud, and as you're wearing your brand new suit, and we can really spell this out, we can really extend it. How do you feel about that guy afterwards, after you've done him this huge favor? My guess is you're going to convince yourself, just like the people in my initiation experiment, that, this guy isn't as bad as I thought he was. This guy isn't as bad as I thought he was. He's a pretty nice guy. Why else would I have gone through all of that trouble to help him? Doing somebody a favor starts a virtuous circle going. So there's little Elliot Aronson sitting on the curb wondering, gee, if these kids got to know me better and found out what a sweet and nice and charming little boy I was, would they like me more? The answer, Elliot, is no. They've already beaten you up. They're busily convincing themselves what a terrible person you are. But if you can somehow get them to do you a favor, to relate to you in a different way, then it comes from the inside out. Then they convince themselves that you're not such a bad guy after all. And maybe other Jews aren't so bad after all. And that brings us to the jigsaw classroom, which I'll do very, very quickly. Austin Public Schools, desegregated, all hell broke loose. Kids were beating each other up, black kids, white kids, Mexican-American kids. They had to close down the schools. We were invited in to see if there was anything we could do. We set up, instead of the highly competitive situation in which kids were vying against each other, which exacerbated the existing stereotypes, we set up these small learning groups called jigsaw groups, where each kid had one piece of the action, and their job was to teach it to the other kids, to help one another, to listen to one another, to give and receive favors from one another. These were cooperative groups. And we found within 6 weeks, kids liked each other better across racial lines. Prejudice and stereotyping decreased enormously. And we were comparing now to classes being taught in the traditional way by some of the best teachers in the school system. Their grades, their performance on objective exams improved to a greater extent than in regular school, and they developed empathy for each other to a greater extent than they did in regular classrooms. The experiment has been repeated in various cities and towns all over the world, and it works almost all the time. And then, when is it? In 1984, on the 30th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision that declared that separate but equal was not the law of the land, which allowed for the desegregation of schools. On the 30th anniversary of Brown versus Board of Education, the United States Civil Rights Commission declared Austin, Texas, as the model city where desegregation was working the way it was meant to work. Never mind the fact that the kids were having fistfights in the corridors and playgrounds of all of the schools in the system, and they had to be shut down. Jigsaw turned that around. Those are the data of the experiment. Underneath the data are hundreds of really interesting stories, many of which have come to me. And I want to share one of them with you. And this will be my last story of the evening. I did a group, I trained some teachers in the South Bronx in New York to do Jigsaw. The South Bronx wasn't having a racial or ethnic problem. It was almost entirely black. The kids in the school were almost entirely black, but they were having a serious bullying problem. And we felt that just as Jigsaw and that kind of cooperation in small groups can help with racial prejudice, it can also help with bullying. So I trained about 20 teachers in the South Bronx to use Jigsaw. About 6 months later, I got a phone call. This was in the summer. I got a phone call 6 months later from one of the teachers who said, Dr. Aronson, I just have to tell you this. And it turns out that she took her students to the Whitney Museum, which is in Manhattan on Madison Avenue. And the subway ride between the South Bronx and Madison Avenue is about 25 minutes. But the psychological distance is enormous. Many of these kids, most of these kids, virtually all those kids have never been to a museum before. So she took them to the museum, and she got them to pause in front of this painting, which is a self-portrait by the artist Arshil Gorky of himself as a boy with his mother, and it was based on a photograph that was taken about a year before her untimely death. And the teacher had with her a book about Gorky in which she had the photograph. And she showed the photograph to the kids as they were standing in front of the painting, and she said, "Why do you suppose the artist would go to all the trouble of painting this painting when he already had the photograph?" Wonderful question. And one of the kids said, well, the painting is bigger. And another kid said, well, the painting is in color and the photograph is only in black and white. And she said, little Willie Johnson cleared his throat to speak. Little Willie Johnson, whose own mother had died a year and a half earlier of a drug overdose, cleared his throat to speak. And she said, Willie Johnson was a very shy kid. And before Jigsaw, he would never, ever have spoken in class, but once we started using Jigsaw, he became more active in class. He cleared his throat to speak, and all eyes turned to Willie. And Willie Johnson pointed to a part of the painting, the mother's hands, and said, maybe he remembered his mother's hands as being so soft, like cotton, and that's why he wanted to paint them that way. The teacher said there was absolute silence in the group, which she said in and of itself was a bit of a miracle with those kids. And then she said, one of the bigger, tougher boys in my class came over and put his arm around Willie Johnson. And then she said, the whole group came together in a kind of a group hug. She said, I was absolutely overwhelmed. And when I heard that story, so was I. And I still am. And that's my love story with social psychology. Thank you. Thank you. I seem to have lost a dog. Oh, there you are. Okay. No.
We have time for just a few questions now. Everyone completely convinced, right?
Wow. Or I talk too long and you need to go because the World Series is on.
I said I enjoyed very much your talk.
But
I'm wondering whether cognitive dissonance is contagious. I mean, you gave the example of Bush. Bush is surrounded by people who basically, I think, convinced him of what he later, justified. But this wasn't his own entirely isolated thinking. So is the ideas really more formed by a group than isolated?
yeah, part of the problem is that Bush surrounded himself with like-minded people, except for Colin Powell, perhaps, whom he either influenced or cowed for a while. But one of the solutions to leadership so that you don't make similar blunders is to surround yourself with people who disagree with you. And the best example of that is Abraham Lincoln. Doris Kearns Goodwin wrote a remarkable book called Team of Rivals. Lincoln surrounded himself with three of his cabinet members were people he had run against for either the nomination or the presidency itself, Seward and people like that, and one of whom had his Secretary of War, Stanton, had called him to his face a long-armed, hairy ape before the election, and he made him Secretary of War. He was at the other extreme end from George W. Bush, and I think most presidents fall in between, where they accept advice, and if they're going off track, at least they're getting diverse opinions. Yeah.
Are there any other questions? Over here?
Right here.
Right over here, sir.
No, lifting my hand up. To your far left. So,
There are hands galore, but I don't see it.
all right. So you said that sort of the there was an evolutionary reason for cognitive dissonance, that being that it enabled you to sleep at night. But what do you propose is the origins for like that sort of suffering that you get from being in contradiction?
Well, okay. Let's say some person living in a cave went to visit his neighbors in a neighboring cave and got a little drunk on whatever mead and made a mild pass at his neighbor's wife, and then when he got back into his own cave, he tried to convince himself that nobody noticed, okay? And that, because the cognition that this other guy might come over and kill him is dissonant with his cognition that he wanted to live, okay? And then he was able to sleep, and the guy might have noticed and didn't do anything about it, and that's the origin. It really is the problem is what makes it, well, I think the question is what makes it uncomfortable to begin with? Because we don't know which way to go. It's after a decision or after an action that doesn't seem right to us, that makes us uncomfortable, and it's the discomfort that if we stay with it, I mean, it's the same thing as asking, how come if you don't eat, you get hungry? How come if you have two cognitions that make you a little bit crazy, how come that's uncomfortable? It is uncomfortable, just as hunger is uncomfortable. And the ability to stay with it, as some people have. My wife is a lousy dissonance reducer, which makes her a wonderful companion, because whenever I start reducing dissonance, she will tell me, no, look at it this way, and she'll have those two cognitions firmly in mind. It's amazing to someone like me, but I watch her do it, and she does it beautifully. But I don't know how her ancestors survived. I'm really glad they did, but I don't know how they did it, because you do a lot of tossing and turning in bed if you can't reduce dissonance easily. Most of us can do it most of the time. See, George Bush slept like a baby in the White House. I really believe that. He says so. He says so. And I think because he's a very, very good dissonance reducer. Too good. Some people, if you're president of the most powerful country in the world, you shouldn't sleep at night. You should have difficulty with your decisions. You should be ruminating all the time. Obama may be ruminating a little too much.
Got one right here.
Hi, I'm wondering, what does this understanding of cognitive dissonance tell us about guilt and about regret and the things that we can't resolve away?
Well, they're very uncomfortable. That's what it tells us. And, the neurotic, the classic definition of a neurosis is if a person feels guilty about minor infractions and has difficulty reducing the dissonance and convincing himself that it really isn't that important. And much of the time it isn't that important. What the self-help people write in their books is, don't sweat the small things. It's good advice. Don't sweat the small things. And most of us are pretty good at reducing dissonance about the small things. When we start reducing dissonance about things that can be harmful to other people, then we're in trouble. When we start reducing dissonance about immoral actions, then we're in trouble. Then our own psyche is in trouble, like the person and we did that experiment, by the way, the people who cheated on the exam and then convinced themselves that cheating is okay. Now, you know, you can substitute for cheating deciding whether to marry a particular person or not, deciding whether to fudge on your income tax or not, deciding whether to have an extramarital affair or not. Each one of these, and an array of others, if you decide on doing the immoral thing and you start convincing yourself that it really isn't so bad, the next thing you know is you become an immoral person. You become that which you want to avoid by reducing the dissonance. So that behavior here, it's very existential. The behavior is paramount. And an immoral person is a person who commits immoral acts. And the way a person slides down that pyramid, the reason that the metaphor of the pyramid is so powerful for me is that you can see the slide. And that means he's much more likely to cheat on the next exam. It would be a lot easier because he's already convinced himself that cheating isn't such a bad thing. A Nazi is much more likely to kill a person if he's already done harm to other people of that race, religion, or ethnic group, because the justification has already set in, and it makes the next most drastic action that much easier. So you see, it's an interesting dilemma, because nobody wants to live with dissonance, nobody wants to live with guilt, but sometimes we should. If it's a small thing, it's helpful to reduce dissonance. If it's a major thing, it can be very harmful. But you see, part of it is what I was trying to do in some of this research is to set up the structure of the institution, like the elementary school classroom, in such a way that if there's going to be dissonance reduction, if there's going to be self-justification, let it go in the direction of peace, reaching out for people, trying to see what's good in your teammates rather than what's negative about them, and that can be very positive. As long as the phenomenon exists, then the question is how can we utilize it to make it work for a better society? Thank you.
Hi, Dr. Aronson. It's a pleasure to hear you speak. The last time I had the pleasure of listening to you was as a student in your class, about 1992 to 1994. So thank you for being here today. My question is about what the research says about insight or self-awareness on cognitive dissonance. Does it act as a moderator? Is there an influence?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think my belief is that real self-esteem that's based on a lot of information about your own self-worth is a good modulator of dissonance and prevents you from reducing it rashly. For example, if you look at the Semmelweis example, the doctors, the physicians who refused to accept the possibility that they could have made a mistake, I would call that, I specifically said that they weren't evil, and I believe that, but I think they might have been a little arrogant. I think they might have been operating on a very fragile kind of self-esteem where it's hard to admit that you've made some terrible mistakes. And if you have a hard time admitting that you've made some terrible mistakes, you increase the probability that you're going to continue to make those same mistakes. And that's the danger. Whereas if a person really has well-grounded self-esteem, he or she might be able to say, oh my God, I did come directly from performing autopsies. I did come directly to my patients. Maybe I did inadvertently kill some of them, I damn well better start washing my hands in chlorine to see how that works out. That's what Semmelweis did, and eventually that's what his colleagues did, but it took them years before they got there. It's a very good question.
Is it on? Oh, cool. Very cool. Particularly with your work, college students using condoms, I was wondering about the other 20%. You said that about 80% were using them consistently, but what about the other 20%? If they didn't use them, did the attempt to create that instinct, did that inoculate them against it? Would it make a second attempt even more difficult to succeed?
I never thought of that. That's a really nice question. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that. I'll have to give it some thought, though. But let me say this. I think that if we couldn't get to them in this experiment, then they were really hell-bent on not using condoms. But I agree, now that I've thought about it, I agree with you. Once they have, in spite of seeing their own hypocrisy, if they continued not to use condoms, they probably worked harder to reduce the dissonance of continuing not to use condoms by finding a way of justifying their actions without really owning up to being a hypocrite. That would take some doing, but the human mind is a very facile thing, and people find very, very creative ways to accomplish what they need to accomplish in terms of their self-esteem and their feelings about how they behave in the world.
Thank you.
Hey, Professor.
Hey.
I want to thank you for coming out too, but my question was, if you're made aware of the fact that you're trying to resolve dissonance, will you still be able to, let's say with the example with your canoe and your wife, she was able to stop your dissonance because she pointed out, oh, well, you only bought the canoe because you wanted to feel better about buying this particular house. For like any other situation, if someone makes you aware of the fact that you're doing this, does it eventually become impossible to resolve that dissonance, and does it just become guilt at that point, or?
Another good question. It certainly would stop the dissonance reduction for that particular thing. Like, I could never really, after my dissonance reducing move was pointed out to me about the canoe lost attractiveness for me immediately. And that's one of the beauties of being married to someone who doesn't reduce dissonance, and won't let me do it either. But for other things, because it operates on an unconscious level, it doesn't mean that I wouldn't be able to reduce dissonance in other ways. And again, I just want to point out that most of the time, it's benign. Most of us are not leaders of the free world, justifying the invasion of Iraq. Most of us are not going to be beating up on other people and trying to justify that by convincing ourselves that those people deserved it. But there are small ways in which we do that. And I think that if I were writing a self-help book, what I would say is, whenever you're making a decision that might reduce your own sense of moral values or cause pain or difficulty or harm to another person, pay attention to what you're doing and keep asking yourself, that's what I do to myself, I keep asking myself, is this the way I really feel, or am I simply justifying behavior that I've already committed? But a lot of the time, I let myself get away with it by not really thinking about it, because I know there are no harmful consequences to other people. And so there's a level of awareness that is, you know, we think of conscious versus unconscious, but there's something in between where you kind of know you're doing something, but you're not quite sure of it, and you let yourself get away with it. And I would say 9 times out of 10, it's a good thing. It's helpful. But on that 10th occasion, I think it's important, when the consequences are dire, to force it into consciousness, to force it into awareness, so you don't commit awful actions in the future.
We'll make this the last one.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you. I learned some cool things from you tonight. My question was, if you were the doctor who learned about, you know, sanitizing your hands, how would you convince the other doctors?
If I was the doctor who
learned to sanitize the hands, you know, to prevent deaths?
I would have washed my hands immediately, of course. Now, I would have consulted with my wife, who would have told me to wash my hands.
Yeah. How would you convince the other doctors? If you were that doctor, how would you convince them?
If I was Semmelweis,
Yes.
gently. You see, one of the problems with Semmelweis is that he was very extreme and very ardent. And my guess is that he may have presented his case by saying, "Do you idiots realize that you've been killing your own patients all these years?" He might have done that because he was a fairly unstable guy who eventually died in an insane asylum, by the way. He was unstable. There are examples. I wrote a book called Mistakes Were Made But Not By Me, which talks about issues like this. And I'll give you a parallel issue. Old people frequently get hoodwinked by telemarketers. Like old people like me, if you're living alone and you're lonely and a telemarketer calls you up and tells you about an investment or something like that, old people have been known to invest a good part of their life savings on shaky investments. And often, they're afraid to tell their children, their grown children, about it, because their grown children are apt to say something like, "What were you thinking when you did that?" Which, of course, makes them feel worse, and then they keep it to themselves, and they set themselves up to be hoodwinked again. The way to get around that is to simply say something like, "Gee, that guy must have been very, very convincing. My God, I can see how anyone could have gone for that." And then to try to get them prepared for that sort of thing where it doesn't threaten their ego. So if I had been Semmelweis and know now what Semmelweis didn't know then, I think I would approach it very gently, try not to make them feel guilty about what they had done, but show them that there are ways to avoid doing it in the future. My guess is, as I said, Semmelweis was not the kind of guy who would have done that gently.
Thank you very much, Elliot, for an engrossing evening.
Thank you.